The morning Letitia Langley stepped off the westbound stage in Harrow Creek, Texas. She had exactly $4.32 in her coat pocket, a carpet bag containing 2 dresses and a broken comb, and a reputation so thoroughly destroyed back in Memphis that the dust from the wheels of that departing coach felt like the kindest farewell she had ever received. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Harrow Creek sat at the edge of the hill country like something God had set down without much deliberation. A scattering of sun-bleached buildings along a single main road that turned to mud when it rained and cracked like old pottery when it did not. The stage stop doubled as a general store, and the man behind the counter barely looked up when she pushed through the door, her traveling dress dark with road dust and her dark hair escaping its pins in the most undignified fashion she could have imagined. She stood just inside the doorway and took one long, measured breath. She had promised herself she would not cry when she arrived. She had cried enough on that 4-day journey, cried until her chest felt scraped hollow, cried for the husband who had died owing half of Memphis money he had gambled away in riverboat parlors, cried for the house that was sold to pay his debts, cried for the name Langley which had once meant something in polite society and now made women draw their skirts aside. She had made herself a promise somewhere in the red clay hills of Arkansas that when she arrived in the place she had chosen on a map chosen, because it was far and because she knew no one there, she would not cry. She would simply begin. So she walked to the counter, set her carpetbag down on the wooden floor, and said to the man with the spectacles and the flour-dusted apron, "I am looking for work. Any work at all. Can you tell me who in this town might need hired help?" The man, whose name she would learn was Gideon Pratt, looked her over the way men looked at women who arrived alone and unannounced with a particular combination of suspicion and pity that she had grown to despise. "What kind of work you do?" he asked. "I can keep books," she said. "I can cook, so teach children their letters, manage a household, or do whatever else is required. I am not particular." Gideon scratched the back of his neck. "Most ranches around here have got their own cooks. Schoolteacher position's been filled since January. You might try the hotel for cleaning work, I suppose." He paused, and something shifted in his expression, something that might have been genuine consideration. "Though if it's steady work you're after, there's one fellow who's been needing a bookkeeper. His last one ran off to California, but he's a hard man to work for, they say. Most folks around here don't stay on his property long." "Who is he?" she asked. "Clement Hayes," Gideon said. "Runs the Double Bar H Ranch about 4 miles east of town. Does more cattle business than anyone in the county, but the man keeps to himself something fierce. Lost his wife 2 years back and hasn't been the same since, from what people say." He looked at her over his spectacles. "You'd be dealing with his ledgers mostly. He's had the accounts sitting untouched since his bookkeeper left. Word is he's been doing them himself and making a right mess of it." Letitia picked up her carpetbag. "How do I get there?" She walked the 4 miles because she could not afford to hire a horse, and the afternoon sun hit her shoulders like a flat iron pressed to cloth. The road east of town wound through scrub oak and cedar, the land rising and falling in gentle waves of pale green and amber, and she was sweating through her collar by the time the Double Bar H came into view. It was a working ranch. That much was plain immediately. Not beautiful in any decorative sense, but impressive in its solidity. A large 2-story house of weathered timber and limestone, a long bunkhouse behind it, 3 substantial barns, fenced pastures stretching in every direction where she could see cattle moving in distant clusters. There was nothing wasted about the place. Every building sat where it sat for a reason, and the fences were in good repair, which told her something about the man who owned it. She pushed open the front gate and walked up the path to the main house. She knocked. There was a long silence, and then boots on wooden floors, and then the door opened. She had not known what to expect of Clement Hayes. Gideon Pratt had called him hard, and that word had conjured in her mind something angular and cold. What she saw was a man of perhaps 35, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who had done physical labor their whole lives, wearing work trousers and a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed shaving and eyes the color of creek water under shade, a brown so deep it was nearly green, or a green so shadowed it red as brown. He was not smiling. He was not frowning either. He was simply looking at her with an expression of complete neutrality, as though women appeared on his doorstep frequently enough that he had stopped assigning them meaning. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "my name is Letitia Langley. I have just arrived in Harrow Creek. I understand you are in need of a bookkeeper, and I am experienced in accounting and ledger work. I would like to apply for the position." He studied her face for a moment. "You walked here?" "I did. From town." "Yes." Something moved behind his eyes. Not pity, she would have walked back down that road before she accepted pity. Something more like reluctant interest. "You had better come in then," he said, and stepped aside. The inside of the house was clean in the way that a house maintained by practical hands rather than loving ones tends to be clean, orderly, functional, entirely without softness. The furniture was good and sturdy but plain. There were no curtains on the windows. There was a desk in the room he led her to, and on that desk there was, as Gideon Pratt had suggested, an absolute catastrophe of accounting. Ledger books lay open across one another. Loose pages had been folded and tucked into wrong sections. Columns of numbers trailed off without conclusion. She looked at it for a full 5 seconds and kept her face composed. "How long has it been since someone organized this properly?" she asked. 8 months, he said, and he sounded like a man who was not accustomed to admitting that anything on his property had gone wrong. "I can have it in order within 2 weeks, she said. "Possibly less, if the original purchase records are accessible." "They're in that crate there," he said, pointing to a wooden crate beneath the desk that was filled with receipts, invoices, and what appeared to be several folded letters. "What are your terms?" "I will need a wage," she said. "Whatever is fair for the work, and I will need somewhere to sleep if you have a room to spare. I have just arrived and have not yet secured lodging in town." He looked at her with that same level, measuring expression. "Where are you from?" "Memphis, Tennessee," she said. "Why did you come to Harrow Creek?" She met his gaze directly. "I needed to start somewhere new. I believe Harrow Creek is as good a place as any for that purpose." He was quiet for a moment. Whatever he made of her answer, whether it satisfied him or simply told him enough, he nodded. "There's a room upstairs, end of the hall. It was my daughter's before she went to live with her aunt in San Antonio. You can have it. Wage is $12 a month plus room and board. If you last the 2 weeks and the books are in order, we'll discuss something more permanent." $12 a month was not a fortune, but it was a foothold. She took it. The room at the end of the hall had a narrow bed, a dresser, and a window that looked east over the pastures. There were no curtains here either. She set her carpetbag on the bed, sat down beside it, and allowed herself exactly 2 minutes of quiet despair, the specific, private kind that belonged only to her and to no one's observation. Then she stood up, washed her hands and face at the basin on the dresser, pinned her hair back properly, and went downstairs to begin sorting through 8 months of financial disorder. The cook, she discovered, was a stout Mexican woman named Rosaria who had worked for the Double Bar H for 11 years, and regarded all newcomers with the measured skepticism of a woman who had outlasted many of them. The ranch hands numbered 6, and they ranged from a boy of about 19 named Tommy Birch to a veteran cowhand named Walt Decker who walked with a limp from an old brake and spoke in complete sentences only when the occasion genuinely demanded it. None of them bothered her, which she appreciated. They watched her, the way people in small, isolated places always watched newcomers, but they kept their watching at a reasonable distance. Clement Hayes himself was rarely in the house during the day. He was out with his men from first light, doing the work of a man who ran 800 head of cattle across several thousand acres of Texas hill country, and when he came in at day's end, he washed up, ate whatever Rosaria had made, and returned to the desk in the study which was now occupied by Letitia, who had taken to working by lamplight until she was too tired to read numbers anymore. On that first evening, he appeared in the doorway at about 8 o'clock, looked at the progress she had made sorting the papers into organized stacks, and said nothing. He merely looked, and then he said, "There's coffee on the stove if you want it," and went to bed. It was, she thought, not an unfriendly thing to say. Over the course of the first week, she reconstructed the ledgers from January through September of the previous year. The ranch's accounts were actually in considerably better shape than the physical disorder of the paperwork had suggested. Clement Hayes was clearly a competent businessman who had simply not had time to impose organization on the raw data of his daily transactions. He had been recording his purchases and sales faithfully, just on whatever scrap of paper was nearest at hand, and her task was essentially to transfer all of it into the proper ledgers and verify the arithmetic. The arithmetic, she found, was almost always correct. He had a natural facility with numbers that she found privately impressive. On the third day, she found a discrepancy. A cattle sale from the previous October had been recorded at one price in the ledger, and at a different, lower price on the receipt from the buyer, a man named Harlan Schofield who ran a competing operation about 20 miles north. The difference was $40, which was not insignificant. She set the two documents side by side and looked at them for a long time. That evening, when Clement came in and she heard him moving around in the kitchen, she carried both papers to him. "Mr. Hayes," she said, setting them on the kitchen table where he was pouring himself coffee, "I found something today that I think you should see." He looked at the papers. He looked at them for a long time. Something in his jaw tightened. "Harlan Schofield," he said, and his voice was flat and contained in the way of a man keeping something carefully in check. "Were you aware of the difference?" she asked. "No," he said. "I wasn't." He picked up both papers and carried them to the window, holding them up in the late light. "He shortchanged me $40 and banked on me not noticing because my bookkeeper had just left." He set the papers down. "I'll be paying Schofield a visit. I can document it properly," she said. "Make a clear accounting of the discrepancy with both records attached, something formal that you can take to him." He looked at her. For the first time since she had arrived, something in his expression shifted from that careful neutrality into something that might have been genuine attention, as though he was seeing her fully for the first time and finding that she was worth seeing. "That would be useful," he said. "Thank you." It was a small thing. 2 words. But in the economy of Clement Hayes's speech, she was already beginning to understand. 2 words meant something. She prepared the documentation, and he rode to Schofield's ranch 2 days later, and he came back with $40 in his pocket and a set expression that suggested the conversation had not been pleasant but had been conclusive. He set the money on the kitchen table, looked at it, and then looked at her. "You've a good eye," he said. "Numbers don't lie," she said. "That is the thing I have always liked best about them." He poured 2 cups of coffee and pushed one toward her across the table, and they sat for a moment in a silence that was, Letitia realized with some surprise, not uncomfortable. It was simply the silence of 2 people occupying the same space without pretense. She had been at the Double Bar H for 9 days when Tommy Birch, the youngest of the ranch hands, accidentally let slip, while she was hanging out the window she had finally gotten around to washing, that folks in town were asking about her. "What kind of asking?" she said, keeping her voice even. Tommy went red in a way that only 19-year-olds could manage. "I don't mean nothing bad by it, ma'am. Just that, well, Gideon Pratt's wife likes to know people's business, and she wrote to her sister in Austin, and there's been some talk about where you came from and whatnot." Letitia had known this was coming. A woman arriving alone, wearing her past like a shadow, could not outrun the telegraph wires and the gossiping networks of small western towns forever. Memphis was not that far in terms of news. She had known that eventually someone would connect the name Langley to the scandal, to the debts, to the whispers that had followed her husband's funeral like crows following a plow. "Thank you for telling me," she said to Tommy, and she kept her voice perfectly steady, and she finished hanging the window before she went back inside. That evening she waited until Clement Hayes had come in and washed up and was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee. Rosaria had gone to her room and the house was quiet except for the sound of crickets starting up outside. "Mr. Hayes," she said, sitting down across from him, "I think I should tell you about myself before you hear it from someone else." He looked at her over his cup. He said nothing, which she took as permission to continue. She told him. She told him about Robert Langley, who had been charming and handsome and completely worthless in the financial sense, who had married her when she was 26 and spent the next 4 years running through the money she had inherited from her father, and then through money he had borrowed from men who were not patient about repayment. She told him that Robert had died of a fever 18 months ago, and that the week of his funeral she had discovered the full scope of the debts, and that the house and the furniture and even her mother's silver candlesticks had gone to pay creditors. She told him that society in Memphis had decided, in the way that society tends to decide such things, that a woman was responsible for her husband's character, and that she must therefore be deficient in some way that had allowed this to happen. She told him that she had been cut off from the social circles that had formed the whole of her life, that women who had been her friends since girlhood had ceased to call, that she had found herself at 29 years of age with nothing to show for 4 years of marriage except a suitcase and a damaged name. She told him all of it without once letting her voice shake. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them burned steady. Outside, the crickets continued their indifferent song. "My wife died of typhoid fever 2 years ago," he said. "Her name was Alina. She was a good woman and a good mother, and there are days when I think this house is still waiting for her to come back and make it feel like something." He looked at the lamp. "After she passed, some people in town decided I must have done something wrong to deserve it. That's the way people are. They need someone to blame for bad things because it makes them feel safer." He looked back at her. "I don't hold a man's past against him, or a woman's. What matters to me is the work in front of us." She had not expected that. She had expected tolerance or perhaps polite dismissal or at worst a request that she leave. She had not expected to be understood. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and drank his coffee. Over the weeks that followed, something quiet and incremental began to happen between them, the way spring comes to the hill country, not all at once but in small daily progressions. A new wildflower one morning, a different quality of light in the afternoon, until eventually you look around and realize the season has changed entirely without your having observed the moment of change. They began talking in the evenings, not always about significant things. Sometimes about the ranch. He would ask her about the books. She would report on what she had found. They would discuss what it meant for the cattle business going forward. But sometimes about other things. He told her about growing up in the hill country, about working his father's land as a boy and buying the double bar H with 10 years of savings when he was 24. She told him about Memphis in the years before the war, about her father's dry goods business, about reading every book in the town library by the time she was 16, because there was nothing else to do on Sunday afternoons. He laughed at that, a real laugh, sudden and brief and warm, and she found herself thinking that it was a sound that deserved to happen more often. She had been on the ranch for 3 weeks when Rosaria told her, in the frankly approving tone of a woman who had decided to take someone under her wing whether they liked it or not, that the last woman who had worked in the house before Letitia had been a younger woman from San Antonio who had tried to turn Clement's head and had caused considerable disruption among the ranch hands and had eventually been sent away. "He is not a man who gives his attention easily," Rosaria said, cutting up an onion with the surgical efficiency of long practice. "But when he does look at you, he does not look away." Letitia was transcribing receipts into the ledger, and she kept her eyes on the page. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," she said. Rosaria made a sound that communicated, very economically, that she thought Letitia knew perfectly well what she meant. The first time Clement Hayes showed her the land properly showed it, not just pointed at a map. It was a Saturday afternoon in early April when the work had reached a natural pause, and he had come to the door of the study and said, without particular preamble, "Would you like to see what you've been keeping the books for?" They rode out on horseback, she on a gentle bay mare named Clara that he kept for the purpose of guests and occasions, and he on his working horse, a big gray named Reuben who moved with the calm confidence of an animal that trusted its rider completely. The hill country in April was something she had not been prepared for. The wildflowers were coming up bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush across every slope, rivers of color between the cedar breaks, and above it all a sky so clear and so deeply blue that it seemed like looking down into water rather than up into air. She had thought Texas would be dry and inhospitable. She had not thought it would be this. "It's beautiful," she said, and the inadequacy of the word embarrassed her. He was quiet for a moment. "First spring Alina ever saw it," she cried, he said. She was from Ohio. She had never seen anything like it. His voice was even, but there was a weight behind it that she recognized, the weight of memories that had not yet finished their grieving. "You must miss her very much," she said carefully. "Every day," he said. "But the land is still here. The cattle are still here. The work doesn't stop for grief." He looked at the slope of wildflowers below them. "My daughter Clara, she's 11. She's living with my wife's sister in San Antonio because I couldn't after Alina died. It didn't seem right for a girl to grow up on a ranch with just ranch hands for company. I send money every month. I see her at Christmas." He paused. "That's the part that's hardest." She thought of the room at the end of the hall, the narrow bed, the dresser. Clara's room, he had called it. She had been sleeping in a child's room that still held, in some quiet way, the absence of the child who should have been in it. "You should bring her home," she said, before she had entirely thought through whether it was her place to say it. He looked at her. Not with offense, but with the look of a man who has heard something he wasn't expecting and is taking a moment to sit with it. "The ranch isn't a place for a little girl on her own," he said. "It could be," she said, "if there were a woman here. A household with a woman in it is a different thing from what you have now." She hesitated. "I could teach her. I was saying to Gideon Pratt when I first arrived that I'm able to teach. If Clara were here, she could have proper lessons, and I don't mean to overstep." "You're not overstepping," he said. He was still looking at her, and the afternoon light was laying itself across the hills around them, and the grass moved in a long, slow breath of wind, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and the moment was full of something that neither of them had yet named. "Let me think on it," he said at last, and they rode on. The town of Harrow Creek, Letitia was discovering, was not an unfriendly place, but it was a watchful one. And as April deepened into May and her presence at the Double Bar H became a fixed fact rather than a temporary novelty, the town began to have opinions about it. She went in every Saturday for supplies, and she could feel the way eyes tracked her in Gideon Pratt's store, could hear the particular quality of silence that fell in conversations when she walked near. She was not naive about what they were thinking. A widow, alone on a widower's ranch. It had a shape that people liked to fill in with their own interpretations. The person who made it explicit was a woman named Ida Carraway, who was the wife of the local banker and who had apparently appointed herself the moral ledger-keeper of Harrow Creek. She caught Letitia outside the general store one Saturday morning in May when Letitia was loading her order into the saddlebag, and she said, with a kind of cheerful malice that was somehow worse than open hostility, "I understand you've come all the way from Memphis, Mrs. Langley. I've heard Memphis is quite the complicated city." And then she paused with a smile that was not a smile, waiting to see what Letitia would do with that. Letitia looked at her for a moment. She thought about what she had survived in the past 18 months. She thought about the 4-day stage journey and the 4-mile walk and the 8 months of disordered ledgers and the $40 discrepancy and the April wildflowers and the sound of Clement Hayes laughing in the kitchen. "It can be," she said pleasantly. "I found I preferred the simplicity of the country." She smiled back, finished loading the saddlebag, and rode back to the double bar H. She told Clement about it that evening, because she had learned by now that not telling him things created a specific kind of distance between them that she did not like. He listened with his arms folded across his chest, leaning against the kitchen counter. When she finished, he said, "Ida Caraway has been trying to run people out of this town for 20 years. She ran off the last school teacher, the one before the current one. She ran off the Methodist minister's wife. She minds other people's lives because she can't stand looking at her own." "She won't stop," Letitia said. "No," he agreed. "She won't." He looked at her with that direct, undecorated look that she had come to understand was his version of genuine communication. "Does it bother you?" "It bothers me," she said honestly, "but it doesn't frighten me. I've already lost everything once because of what people said about me. There's a particular freedom in having already been at the bottom." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a remarkable thing to say," he said. "Is it? I find it simply true. Most people would be frightened." "I think I used up my fear on the journey here," she said. He smiled at that. Not the sudden, brief, warm laugh. This was something quieter, more private, a smile that happened in the corner of his mouth and in the deepening of the lines around his eyes. She had come to collect these rare expressions of his the way a person collects good river stones, not because they were rare exactly, but because they were genuine, and because genuine things in her experience had not been plentiful. In early June, something happened that nobody at the double bar H had anticipated. Clement Hayes rode into town for a meeting with his bank and came back with a letter from his sister-in-law in San Antonio, and at dinner that evening his face had an unfamiliar quality, not quite worry, not quite hope, but something poised between the two. "Margaret is getting married," he said, setting the letter down on the table. "In October. She says she thinks it would be best if Clara came home to the ranch before then, so Clara has time to settle before the wedding changes Margaret's household." Rosaria, who had been carrying a dish to the table, set it down and looked at him with an expression of pure satisfaction. "Finally," she said, in the tone of a woman who had been waiting for this for 2 years. He looked at Letitia. "You said she could have lessons," he said. "Did you mean that?" "I meant every word of it," she said. He nodded. "I'll write Margaret tonight. Clara can come in July." The weeks before Clara's arrival had a particular quality of anticipation about them. Letitia found herself turning over the question of the girl's room, the narrow bed and the bare dresser, and deciding that if a child was coming home after 2 years, she deserved to come home to something that felt like a welcome. She mentioned this to Clement obliquely, framing it as a practical suggestion about household preparation, and he said, "Whatever you think is right," which she understood as both permission and trust. She went into town and spent some of her wages on fabric. Not much, just enough to make curtains for the room and a quilt covering, choosing a bright yellow because it was cheerful, and because yellow was the color of the wildflowers that had been growing along the pasture fence in May. She spent 2 evenings sewing them in the kitchen by lamplight, and Clement sat across the table from her those evenings working on papers of his own, and they talked while she sewed about Clara, about what the girl was like, about the ranch and the coming summer, about books they had read and things they had seen, and the particular quality of the sky at different times of year in the hill country. Those evenings acquired a domesticity that Letitia did not examine too closely, because examining it felt like reaching for something she might not be permitted to keep. One evening she looked up from her sewing and found him watching her with an expression she had not seen from him before. It was unguarded in a way his face rarely was. There was something in it that was tender and sad at the same time, and when he saw that she had noticed, he did not look away immediately. He held her gaze for one long moment and then he said, "Thank you for all of this. You've given me a great deal," she said. "A place to work, a room, the chance to—" She stopped. She had been about to say the chance to be someone again. "It seems right to give something back." "You've given more than you know," he said. His voice was quiet. He was still looking at her, and the lamp was between them again, steady and warm, and the evening was very still. She went back to her sewing, But something had shifted in the room, and both of them felt it, and neither of them said anything about it, because some things need to be approached slowly or not at all. Clara Hayes arrived on a Thursday morning in the middle of July on the stage from San Antonio, escorted by a family friend who turned around and went back the same day. Letitia went with Clement to meet the stage in town, which itself was the subject of some observation from Ida Caraway and her circle, but Letitia had stopped finding this worth her attention. The child who stepped off that stage was 11 years old, small for her age, with her father's brown-green eyes and her mother's dark red hair, and an expression of careful assessment that reminded Letitia very much of Clement himself. She looked at her father for a long moment when she stepped down, and then she went to him and put her arms around his waist and pressed her face against his chest, and he held her with both arms and shut his eyes, and Letitia looked away to give them that moment. When they parted, Clara looked at Letitia with those measuring eyes. "You're the bookkeeper," she said. "I am," Letitia said, "and I'm also going to be your teacher if you'll have me." Clara considered this. "What did you teach before?" "I haven't taught formally before," Letitia said, "but I read a great deal and I'm good at numbers and I think I can make learning interesting if you're willing to meet me halfway." Clara looked at her for another moment, then looked at her father, then looked back. "All right," she said, with the tone of someone granting a provisional arrangement. In the buckboard on the way back to the ranch, Clara sat between them, and after a few miles she began asking questions about the ranch in the enthusiastic, slightly breathless way of a child who has been holding questions in reserve for 2 years. She asked about the cattle and about the horses, and about whether old Reuben was still alive, and whether Tommy Birch had gotten any taller, and whether the creek that ran along the south pasture still had the deep pool where she used to wade. Clement answered each question patiently and in detail, and Letitia watched him become, gradually, a different version of himself, warmer, more present, the guardedness that was his habitual expression softening into something that was simply a father talking to his daughter. When they arrived at the ranch and Clara ran ahead to find Rosaria and exclaim over the new curtains in her room, Clement stepped down from the buckboard and reached up to help Letitia down, and for a moment she was standing close to him, his hand under her elbow, the warm July air around them thick with cedar and sunshine. "She likes you," he said. "She's still deciding," Letitia said. "Clara always knows right away," he said. "When she's still deciding, she already likes you. When she doesn't, she just says so." Letitia laughed. "She sounds like her father." He smiled, the full rare one, not the corner of the mouth one but the real one, and for a moment they stood there in the afternoon light without moving, and then Clara's voice came from inside the house calling, "Papa, come look." And the moment dissolved and they went inside. The summer deepened around the double bar H in the way that Texas summers do, relentlessly and beautifully, and without apology. The days were long and hot, and Letitia established a morning routine of lessons with Clara in the cool hours before the heat set in arithmetic and reading and geography. And because Clara had a natural gift for it that Letitia discovered in the second week, drawing and the observation of natural things. Clara liked to sit outside with her slate and sketch the plants and insects she found around the property with a minute attention to detail that was impressive. Letitia began assigning her natural history as a formal subject, and they spent some of their lesson time in the field, identifying grasses and flowers and watching the behavior of the hawks that circled over the south pasture. Clara, Letitia discovered, was a child who missed her mother in a way that had gone quiet and deep, the way grief goes in children who have learned that adults are uncomfortable with it. She never spoke about Alina directly, but there were moments, when she was drawing, particularly, with the intense focused quiet that drawing required, when her face had a look of internal distance that was not childhood peace but childhood sorrow made still. One afternoon in August, Letitia sat beside her at the big kitchen table where they usually did lessons, and Clara was drawing the moth she had caught in a jar that morning, and she said, without looking up from her drawing, "Did Rosaria tell you about my mother?" "Your father did," Letitia said. "A little. She used to draw too," Clara said. Papa said I got it from her. She was quiet for a moment, adding a detail to the moth's wing with a careful hand. I don't really remember her drawing. I remember her singing. She used to sing when she cooked. Rosaria doesn't sing. What did she sing? Letitia asked. Church songs mostly, and one about a river. I don't remember all the words. Letitia was quiet. Then she said softly, "Do you miss her?" Clara looked up from the drawing. Her brown-green eyes were steady. "Every day," she said, using her father's exact words without knowing it. Letitia reached over and put her hand over Clara's briefly and said nothing because nothing was the right thing. After a moment, Clara went back to her drawing. That evening, Letitia told Clement about the conversation, as she had taken to telling him things. Not to inform him of problems, but simply because she had learned that he needed to know what was happening with Clara. Needed to know it in the way that an absent parent craves updates. Not because he was neglectful, but because the distance of the previous 2 years had carved a gap between him and his daughter's interior life, that both of them were cautiously rebuilding. He listened, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, and when she finished he was quiet for a long time. "I should have brought her home sooner," he said. "You thought you were doing what was best for her," she said. "I thought the ranch wasn't a proper place for a girl," he said. "But what she needed was her father, and I was too much inside my own grief to see it." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Eleanor would have told me that. She'd have said, 'Clement Hayes, you are using being sad as an excuse not to be present.'" He almost smiled. "She wasn't a patient woman. That was one of the things I loved best about her." "Clara is all right," Letitia said. "She is more than all right. She is strong and curious and careful, and she is going to be fine." He looked at her. "Because of you," he said. "Some of it is because of you." She shook her head. "It's because she's her father's daughter," she said. He was looking at her with that unguarded expression again, the one that appeared occasionally and without warning, and that she had not yet found a way to respond to that felt entirely safe. The air between them in the kitchen had a particular quality in that moment, weighted and bright at the same time, the way the air feels before a summer storm. "Letitia," he said. Her name in his mouth had a different quality from how anyone else said it. She had noticed this before and filed it away, but in this moment it was impossible to file away. It sat in the room between them like something real and touchable. "Yes," she said, not as a question but as a response to the thing neither of them had said. "I have been thinking," he said, "about a great many things, about what it means when your house stops being empty, about what it means when you look forward to evening because of a person rather than because the day's work is done." He set the coffee cup down and looked at his hands for a moment. "I am not a man who is easy about these things. I was with Eleanor because I had known her since we were young, and it built slowly. I don't know how to do this quickly, and I don't think I should try." "No," she said, "quickly would be wrong. But I would like you to know," he said, "that it is not simply the bookkeeping that makes me glad you are here." She looked at him across the table. The lamp was between them. Outside, the summer night was making its usual conversation: crickets, a distant coyote, the movement of horses in the near pasture. "I would like you to know the same thing," she said. "In the other direction." He nodded slowly. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has decided to take care of. And then he said, "Then we will go slowly and we will do it right." And that was how it began. Slowly was not a word that described what Letitia had expected of herself at 29, widowed, and starting over in a ranch in the Texas Hill Country. But slowly turned out to be the exact right pace for what was happening between her and Clement Hayes, which was not a whirlwind, had never been going to be a whirlwind, but was instead something more like the building of a good structure, foundation by foundation, plank by plank, with attention to every joint and no shortcuts taken. Through August they were careful with each other in a way that Clara, watching them with her father's observant eyes, clearly found both amusing and encouraging. They walked together in the evenings after dinner, just around the near pasture, a 15-minute circuit that was never merely a walk, and talked about the things that mattered and the things that didn't, and each evening added another layer to what they were building. He told her about his years before Alina, about the lonelier seasons of a young man building something from nothing in a hard country. She told him about her girlhood, the good parts, the Sundays in her father's library, the summer she had learned to ride at her cousin's farm in Virginia, the sound of Memphis in the evening when the heat broke and the whole city breathed out at once. In September, he began finding reasons to be near her that were not strictly required by work or household management. He would come to stand in the doorway of the study when she was working, not to ask anything, just to be in the proximity. When they rode out together to check the south herd, he would slow Reuben to walk beside her mare without comment. When she reached for something at the kitchen table, their hands came close and neither of them moved away. The first time he touched her intentionally, not the polite assistance of helping her down from the buckboard, but the first time he reached across the space between them, because he meant to, was on a Sunday evening in late September when they were sitting on the porch after dinner. Clara had gone in to read, and Rosaria had retired, and the hill country evening was performing itself magnificently, all amber light and long shadows, and the first coolness after a long summer. She had been talking about something, the accounts, perhaps, or the progress of Clara's reading, and she had stopped mid-sentence because she had looked up and found him watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something that was neither the evaluating look nor the unguarded tender one, but something new, something that was simply want, clear and clean and private. He reached over and took her hand. His hand was large and weathered and warm, and he held hers with a carefulness that was, in its own way, more eloquent than any speech she had heard in her life. Neither of them said anything. The evening did its work around them. The lights shifted. Somewhere down in the cedar, a whippoorwill started up. After a long time, she turned her hand over in his, and their fingers closed together, and that was all. That was everything. In October, two things happened in fairly quick succession that changed the landscape of what was happening between them. The first was that Ida Carroway, emboldened perhaps by the fact that her earlier comment had not produced the desired effect, wrote a letter to the county minister, suggesting that the situation at the Double Bar H was improper and that something should be done about it. The minister, a mild and sensible man named Reverend Abbott, came to the ranch not to censure but to speak to Clement privately, though it was Letitia who opened the door to him, and his expression when he saw her was perfectly respectful, which she appreciated. The conversation he had with Clement, as Clement related to her that evening, had been straightforward. The Reverend had said he had no concerns of his own, but that there was talk in town that Clement might want to be aware of. Clement had said he was aware of it and that it didn't change anything. The Reverend had nodded and gone back to town. But that evening, after reporting this conversation, Clement was quiet for a while, and then he said, "I don't intend to let Ida Carroway's opinion determine anything, but I also don't want your name talked about. You've had enough of that." "I have," she said, "but I can bear it." "You shouldn't have to," he said. He was quiet again for a moment. Then he said, with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing his words the way he chose the right tool for a particular job, "I am not asking out of any pressure from anyone. I want you to understand that clearly. But I have been thinking that what I feel is not going to change. I have known that since July. I would like, if it is what you want and not before you're certain, I would like to give you something permanent here." She looked at him. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said. "I am," he said, "though not gracefully, I'm aware." She thought about it for a moment, not because she was uncertain. She had not been uncertain about this since that September evening on the porch, but because the question deserved a moment of honest attention rather than a reflexive yes. She was 30 years old, and she had been married once to a man who had been charming and had cost her everything. She was asking herself whether she trusted this. Not him, she trusted him absolutely, which was itself new and remarkable, but the institution, the act of giving herself again to the legal and social structure of a marriage. But this was not Robert Langley's parlor in Memphis. This was Clement Hayes's kitchen in the hill country of Texas, and the man looking at her across the table was someone who had said he would go slowly and had gone slowly, and had not once in 7 months said or done a thing that was not exactly what he said it was. "Yes," she said, "I would very much like that." He reached across the table and took her hand, and his face had the expression of a man who has been holding something carefully for a very long time and has just been told he can set it down gently. They married in November, a quiet ceremony in Harrow Creek's little church with Reverend Abbott presiding, and Clara standing up with them, and Walt Decker and Tommy Birch and Rosaria in the pews. Gideon Pratt was there too, standing in the back with his hat in his hands, and he beamed when they came out into the November sunshine as though he had personally arranged the whole thing. Ida Caraway was not in attendance, which suited everyone present. Clara, in a new dress that Letitia had made for her in a dark green that matched her eyes, stood beside her father during the ceremony with her hand in his, and her face carrying the particular expression of a child who is privately very happy and does not know how to fully express it. When Reverend Abbott said the final words and Clement and Letitia turned to face the small congregation as a married couple, Clara reached out and took Letitia's hand too, without preamble or ceremony, just took it and held it. And Letitia looked down at her and felt something in her chest make a sound like a door opening. After the ceremony and the small celebration that Rosaria had organized at the ranch, she had been cooking for 3 days. The guests dispersed and the evening came down, and Clara fell asleep in her yellow-curtained room, and the house was quiet. Clement stood at the window of their room now, not just his room at the end of a different hall, and looked out at the November night, the stars beginning to populate the sky above the hills, and Letitia came to stand beside him, and he put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned against him, and neither of them needed to say anything at all. But then he said, quietly, "You came here with $4.32. Aft surprised. "How do you know that?" "Tommy told me," he said. "He said you told him once, making a joke of it. He said you'd said you arrived in Harrow Creek with 32 cents more than you needed." She shook her head, smiling. "I was trying to be brave about it." "You were brave about it," he said. He looked down at her. "You are the most quietly brave person I have ever met." He reached into his coat pocket and she felt him do it, and she looked up to find him holding a folded paper. "I had this drawn up last week," he said. "I was going to give it to you after the ceremony, but everything happened so fast. I want to give it to you now." She took the paper and unfolded it. It was a legal document drawn up by the county land office in official hand, and it was a deed. She read it twice. Her name, Letitia Langley Hayes now. Both names was on a deed for 30 acres of the Double Bar H property, the south parcel along the creek, registered in her name specifically and not in the name of the marriage and not contingent on anything. She looked up at him. She could not quite speak. "It's yours," he said. "Not ours, yours. It was always going to be yours from the first day you came to this house and sat down at that desk and found a $40 discrepancy before you had been here a week." His voice was steady, but his eyes were not entirely steady, and she loved him for that. "You came here with nothing and you built something, and I want you to know, I want you to have something that no one can ever take. Whatever happens, you have something." She looked at the deed in her hands. 30 acres along Harrow Creek. 30 acres of wildflowers in spring and cedar in winter and hawks over the south pasture and good limestone soil and water. 30 acres of hers. She had stood in Gideon Pratt's store 7 months ago with $4.32 and a broken comb, and she had been nothing except what she was willing to make of herself. Now she had something. She looked up at Clement Hayes, her husband, and there were tears in her eyes, and she was not remotely sorry about them. "Now you have something," he said softly. "Yes," she said, "I do." She stepped forward and put her arms around him and held on, and he held her back with both arms, solid and certain as the limestone under the hill country soil. And outside the November stars were doing their ancient patient work, and the ranch was quiet, and the creek was running somewhere in the dark below the south pasture, running along the land that was now hers, running the way it had always run, indifferent to human sorrow and human joy alike, but there nonetheless permanent and real. The winter that followed was the kind of winter that rewrites a person's understanding of what home means. Letitia had spent the previous winter in a Memphis boarding house, eating alone at a table with 5 strangers, listening to snow tap against windows that belonged to someone else. This winter she spent in a house that was warm not just from the fireplaces, but from the life inside it. Clara at her lessons in the morning, Rosaria producing improbable quantities of food from the ranch kitchen, the ranch hands coming in from the cold in the evenings to eat together in the bunkhouse, with sounds of talk and occasional laughter drifting across the yard, and Clement in the evenings by the study fire, reading or working on papers or simply sitting with the quality of peace that she had come to understand was his version of contentment. She had not known before that a house could feel like this. Her father's house had been warm but anxious. Her father was a kind man but a worried one, always fretting over the business, always carrying the next season's accounts behind his eyes. Robert Langley's house had been elegant and cold in the way that houses are when they are maintained for impression rather than life. This house was different. This house was simply itself, unpretentious and solid, and the people in it were simply themselves. And in the evenings when they gathered in the kitchen or the sitting room, there was no performance being maintained, and she had not known until she stopped maintaining one how much of her energy maintaining one had consumed. In December, Clement's daughter Clara gave her a gift that she had not expected. They were at the kitchen table, 2 days before Christmas, and Clara pushed a folded piece of paper across the table with the particular combination of shyness and determination that was characteristic of her at her most sincere. Letitia unfolded it. It was a drawing Clara's precise, careful hand, done in the charcoal pencil she preferred of the view from the porch looking south toward the creek. The hills and the cedar and the far line of the water, and in the foreground, 2 figures standing together looking out. A tall man and a woman beside him, close together, their proportions unmistakably Clement and Letitia. In the margin Clara had written, "This is home." Letitia looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Clara. "Thank you," she said. "This is the best gift I have received in a very long time." Clara nodded in the pragmatic way she had and went back to her bread and honey, but she was smiling. Christmas came and went with more warmth than the double bar H had seen in 2 years. Rosaria cooked enough for twice their number, and Clement brought a tree in from the cedar stand, and they decorated it with what ornaments they had, and with stars that Clara cut from paper. And in the evening they sat around the fire and Clement read aloud from the book of Job, which he always read at Christmas because Eleanor had liked it. And afterward Letitia played carols on the old piano in the parlor. A piano she had discovered in October and begun reacquainting herself with, and Clara and Rosaria sang, and the ranch in December was very far from everything that had hurt. January and February were quiet. The quietness of a Texas hill country winter, cold but not severe, the land resting under pale sky, the cattle enduring. Letitia had the ranch accounts in the best shape they had ever been in, and she had begun, in January, to take a more active interest in the business itself, not just recording transactions but understanding them, asking Clement questions about the cattle market, about what drove prices up and down, about the supply routes and the buyers and the competition from ranches to the north and west. He answered her questions seriously, which she appreciated. He did not condescend, and he did not simplify. He talked to her as he would talk to a partner, because that was what she was becoming. Not simply a bookkeeper now, and not simply a wife in the domestic sense, but a genuine partner in the management of the double bar H, bringing to it a clarity of financial thinking and an organizational capacity that complemented his practical expertise and his knowledge of the land. In February, They had a long evening conversation about the possibility of expanding the cattle operation to include a breeding program for a better grade of beef animal, which would require investment, but would likely produce significantly better returns within 5 years. She had run the numbers 3 different ways before the conversation, and she presented them to him over the kitchen table with the same directness she had always brought to the ledgers. He listened, asked questions, went silent for a while, and then said, "You're right, the numbers hold." "They do," she said. "I've been thinking about it for a year, but I never had anyone to think through it with properly," he said. She looked at him across the table. "You do now," she said. He smiled. "I do," he said. In March, she discovered she was pregnant. She told him on a Tuesday morning, standing in the kitchen with her coffee cup in both hands, having just assembled the certainty of it in her own mind sufficiently to say it out loud. He was eating breakfast at the table and she said, "Clement, I think we are going to have a baby." He put down his fork. He looked at her. The expression on his face was one she had not seen before and could not have anticipated a kind of stunned, opening joy. The joy of someone who had not dared to anticipate something good and has just been surprised by it anyway. He stood up from the table and came to her and put both his hands on her face and looked at her like she was something extraordinary, which nobody had looked at her like before, and she felt every molecule of the past 2 years rearrange itself into a different story. "Are you well?" he said. "Are you feeling all right?" "I am perfectly fine," she said. "I just wanted you to know." He kissed her forehead and then her cheek and then, slowly and deliberately, her mouth, and held her close in the kitchen. And outside the March morning was doing something magnificent with the light, and Rosaria appeared in the doorway from the back porch, took one look at them, understood everything immediately and said, "I will make soup," which was her response to all major events, and went back outside. Clara, when told, was characteristically direct about it. She considered the information for a moment, then said, "Will it be a boy or a girl?" "We won't know for some time," Letitia said. "I would like a brother," Clara said. "I have always had everything on my own." A brother would be different. Clement, watching this exchange from across the table, had an expression of such profound happiness that it required no translation whatsoever. The spring of 1879 arrived with the same generosity as the spring before, the bluebonnets and the paintbrush sweeping across the slopes, the creek running full from winter rains, the cattle moving in their unhurried patterns across the pastures. Letitia was showing by April, and she continued working at the desk and riding out to the south pasture and teaching Clara her lessons, because she was not the kind of woman who stopped doing things because she was pregnant. And Clement, having known her for nearly a year by then, did not expect her to stop. He did, however, begin to find small ways to make everything slightly easier for her, appearing beside her when she wanted to lift something heavy, saddling Clara's mare for morning lessons without being asked, bringing her coffee in the study without comment. These were small things, thoughtful things, the accumulated gestures of a man who was paying attention, and she received them as they were intended. In May, Gideon Pratt stopped her in the store and shook her hand with genuine warmth and said, "I'm glad you asked me about work that day, Mrs. Hayes. I'm glad I sent you to the double bar H," and she thought that she was glad, too glad for all of it, even the hard parts, because the hard parts had brought her here to this store, to this handshake, to this life. Ida Carroway, to no one's surprise, had not made her peace with events. She had written 2 more letters to 2 different reverends, and had made several pronouncements at the women's circle about the state of morality in the county, all of which had been received with decreasing interest because by now people had observed that Letitia Hayes was a good woman, a hard worker, a patient teacher to Clara, and a loyal partner to Clement, and all of this was more persuasive than any letter. Even Ida's closest allies were beginning to find her campaign tiresome. The matter came to its natural end one June afternoon in the general store when Ida cornered Letitia near the bolts of fabric and said, with the kind of precision that suggested she had been saving this, I hear you've quite made yourself comfortable at the double bar H, Mrs. Hayes. Isn't it fortunate for you that Clement was lonely enough to overlook your history? Letitia had the distinct clarity of feeling that comes to a person who has completely run out of patience with a particular kind of meanness. She looked at Ida Caraway and thought about every time she had bitten back a response, every time she had let the woman's remark slide without answering, and she felt all of that patience drain out of her like water from a bucket with a hole in it. She said, very quietly and very clearly, "Mrs. Caraway, I arrived in this town with nothing except my own capability and my willingness to work. I have earned my place at the double bar H with 7 months of honest labor before I was anyone's wife. My history, as you call it, consists of surviving a difficult marriage with my integrity intact and coming to a new place and beginning again, which is something that many people in this town have also done and would do well to remember before judging others for it. I am going to suggest that you direct your formidable energy towards something that deserves it, because your campaign against me has run its course, and everyone in this town knows it." There was a silence in the store. Gideon Pratt, behind the counter, appeared to be studying the ceiling with great intensity. Ida Caraway looked at her. Something shifted in her face, not an apology, nothing so far as that, but a recognition of some kind, a reckoning with the fact that she had met a wall she could not move. She said nothing further, and Letitia finished her shopping and went home. That evening she told Clement what had happened, expecting him to be pleased. Instead, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said with a carefully contained expression, "I should have said something to her a long time ago. I should not have left that to you." "I handled it," she said. "I know you did," he said. "That's not the point. The point is that you've been managing her comments for 7 months while I stood by and let it go because I didn't want to cause trouble in town. That was wrong of me. You are my wife. You should not have to defend yourself alone." She looked at him. He was genuinely bothered by this, not by what Ida had said, but by his own failure to stand between it and Letitia. She reached across the table and touched his hand. "You couldn't have said it for me," she said. "I needed to say it myself." "Why?" he said. "Because I have been letting other people define me for 3 years," she said. "First the creditors, then society, then the gossips here. I needed to be the one to say enough. I needed to do that for myself." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I understand that." "I know you do," she said. "That is one of the things I love about you." The word love had been between them for months, in gestures and glances and the texture of their evenings together, but she had not said it like that before, plainly and directly, sitting across a kitchen table on a summer evening in June. She said it now without calculation and without fear. He looked at her for a long moment. His brown-green eyes were very steady. "I love you, Letitia," he said. "I love you more than I thought I was still capable of." She smiled at him. "I know that too," she said. "But it's very good to hear." He reached across the table and took her hand, and they stayed like that in the kitchen while the summer evening turned to night outside, and neither of them needed anything else. The summer went on in its generous way. The breeding program Letitia had proposed in February was underway, with 3 prize bulls purchased from a ranch near Fredericksburg and the careful selection of breeding stock from their own herd. The additional investment showed in the ledgers as a significant outlay, but the projections held, and Clement trusted the numbers because she had given him reason to trust her numbers. Walt Decker, who had initially been the most skeptical of the operation's hands about the new approach, had come around to it with the pragmatic adaptability of an experienced cowhand who knew that fighting a sensible change was more trouble than it was worth. Tommy Birch, the young ranch hand, had in the meantime discovered that Gideon Pratt had a daughter named Nell, 17 years old, with whom he had developed an absolutely transparent attachment that he apparently believed was invisible to everyone around him. Clara found this endlessly entertaining and made observations about it at dinner with a dry accuracy that made Clement cough to disguise his amusement. Letitia did not try to disguise hers at all. Life on the double bar H had a texture now that it had not had before, not just functional but full, with the small dramas and pleasures of a real household, a family in the true sense, and Letitia moved through her days with a sense of rightness that she recognized as happiness, the actual quiet, durable kind, and not the performed version she had spent years trying to sustain in Memphis. Her pregnancy was going well. She was 30 years old, healthy and sensible about it, resting when she needed rest and working when she felt like working and not catastrophizing in either direction. The doctor in Harrow Creek, a practical man named Dr. Enoch Wills, came out to the ranch in July and declared everything in good order and predicted a September delivery. In August, Clara asked if she could come in when the baby was born. "Not in the room," Letitia said carefully. "Obviously not in the room," Clara said with the tone of someone who found the clarification unnecessary. "I mean in the house, close by, so I can know right away." "Of course," Letitia said. "I wouldn't have it any other way." Clara nodded, satisfied. Then, after a moment, she said, "Will you still teach me after the baby comes?" "Yes," Letitia said. "I will teach you until you know everything I know, and then I'll find you someone who knows more than I do." Clara looked at her with those precise eyes. "I'm going to be a naturalist," she said. "I've decided." "That is an excellent decision," Letitia said. "You have the mind for it." "I know," said Clara, without false modesty, which was one of the qualities Letitia had always liked best about her. The baby was born on the 23rd of September, 1879, on a Tuesday morning when the hill country was beginning its September turn toward autumn, the air carrying for the first time that particular coolness that comes off the hills in early morning when the summer is ending. It was a long labor, harder than she had hoped and shorter than she had feared, and Dr. Wills was there and Rosaria was there, and Clara sat in the hall outside the bedroom door for 4 hours with her drawing things, making a very detailed sketch of the door itself, and Clement stood in the kitchen doing things with his hands, chopping wood, then running out of wood to chop, then making coffee, then making more coffee, then standing at the kitchen window looking out at the September morning, with an expression that Walt Decker later described to Tommy Birch as looking like a man who was trying to hold himself together using only willpower. When Rosaria came to the kitchen door and said, "It is a boy and both are well," Clement Hayes sat down in the nearest chair and put his face in his hands for a moment and did not say anything. Then he stood up and went upstairs. The boy was small and red and healthy and entirely himself from the first moment, squinting at the light with an expression of comprehensive disagreement that made Letitia laugh even in her exhaustion. She held him against her chest and looked at Clement, who was sitting on the edge of the bed looking at both of them with an expression of such complete and undefended love that she had to look back down at the baby because otherwise she was going to cry, and she preferred to manage her crying in private. "What shall we call him?" Clement asked. She had thought about this. "James," she said, "for my father, if you agree." "James Hayes," he said. He nodded slowly. "That's a good name." Clara appeared in the doorway, having followed her father up the stairs the moment she heard his boots on them. She looked at the baby with intense scientific interest. "He is very small," she said. "He will get bigger," Letitia said. "He looks like Papa," Clara said, tilting her head. "He does rather," Letitia agreed. Clement put his arm around Clara's shoulders, and the four of them were in the room together, and the September morning was coming through the window, and somewhere below in the kitchen Rosaria was making soup, and the double bar H was alive in a way it had not been for 2 years, and Letitia held her son and felt the full measure of everything she had traversed to arrive here. She thought of a stagecoach in April dust. She thought of $4.32. She thought of the 4-mile walk on a hot afternoon, and the desk full of disordered ledgers, and the $40 discrepancy, and the first evening's coffee, and the deed in her hands in the November lamplight. Now you have something. She had a great deal more than something. The months that followed James's birth were both difficult and joyful in the overlapping way that new parenthood always is. The sleepless nights and the immeasurable tenderness, the exhaustion and the wonder, and through all of it, the particular revelation of watching Clement Hayes with a baby in his arms. He was not awkward about it as some men were. He had done this before with Clara, and he held James with the practiced ease of a man who found it natural, and who found it. She could see this plainly healing in some way she was glad for him to have. Clara was a devoted and practical older sister, approaching the task of it with her characteristic combination of intense attention and dry commentary. She reported her observations of James's development with the same careful precision she applied to the natural world, noting when his eyes began to track movement, when he first reached for a hanging object, when his unfocused new person expression began to resolve into something that looked recognizably like a face. Their father's face, as she had predicted, with perhaps a suggestion of Letitia's wide mouth. By spring of 1880, James was 6 months old and robust and loud and pleased with himself, and the double bar H was running at its best in years, the breeding program beginning to show results in the quality of the new cattle coming through, the accounts healthy and the future legible for the first time in a long time. In April of that year, Clement came home from town one afternoon with 2 pieces of news. The first was that Tommy Birch had formally asked Gideon Pratt for permission to court his daughter Nell, which had been granted, which news delighted Letitia and Clara equally. The second piece of news was that the county land office had received an inquiry about purchasing the south parcel of the double bar H, the 30 acres along the creek that was registered in Letitia's name, from a development concern out of Austin that was trying to acquire land along the creek corridor. He put this second piece of news on the table between them in an entirely neutral tone, making it clear without saying, so that whatever she decided about the land that was hers was her decision alone. She thought about it for one evening. The next morning she wrote to the development concern and declined. "It's mine," she told Clement simply when she told him what she had done. "I don't intend to sell it. I intend to pass it on to James someday, or to Clara if she wants it, along with the rest of the ranch." He looked at her and nodded once. "That's exactly right," he said. She felt it then, the full settled weight of belonging to a place, not just living in it but being of it, her name on the land and the land's memory holding her name. She had come to Harrow Creek because it was far from Memphis, and because the map had offered it to her as a blank page. It was no longer a blank page. It was a full one now, written over with the particulars of her life, the ledgers and the wildflowers and the yellow curtains, and the creek running in the dark and James sleeping in the upstairs room, and Clara sketching her careful pictures of moths and hawks and the view from the south porch. The summer of 1880 was the finest summer the double bar H had seen in a decade, if you asked Walt Decker, who had been there for most of a decade and had a basis for comparison. The cattle were healthy, the prices were good, the breeding program was producing the results the numbers had predicted, and there was, in the house and on the land around it, the irreducible energy of a place where people were genuinely invested in being. Letitia and Clement fell into the rhythms of a partnership that was comfortable without being routine, dynamic without being turbulent. They disagreed occasionally, about the pace of expansion, about what to do when a drought the following year threatened the south pasture, about a proposal from a buyer in San Antonio that Letitia thought was overvalued, and Clement thought was worth exploring. And they disagreed the way 2 people who respect each other disagree, with evidence and listening and the willingness to be wrong, and usually they arrived somewhere together that neither of them had found alone. By the summer of 1880, Ida Caraway had, in the way of people who finally exhaust their own campaigns, found other concerns to occupy her. The women of Harrow Creek had largely made their peace with Letitia Hayes, and several of them, most notably Gideon Pratt's wife, who had started the whole telegraph chain in the beginning, and who now seemed to feel a proprietary affection for the outcome, had become genuinely friendly. The school in town was growing, and Letitia had been asked to sit on the small committee that was trying to bring in a second teacher, and she brought the same organized, unpretentious clarity to that committee that she brought to the ranch accounts. Reverend Abbott, who had come to the ranch to deliver Ida Caraway's concerns almost 2 years ago, came again in the autumn of 1880, this time at Letitia's invitation, to baptize James. The ceremony was small and warm, the same handful of people who had been at the wedding, plus Tommy Birch and Nell Pratt, who were now engaged, and the hill country autumn was doing its amber and copper work outside the church windows, and James Hayes was baptized James Clement Hayes, holding his mother's finger in his fist and regarding the proceedings with the settled blue-eyed seriousness of a child who has decided to take the world at face value. Clara, standing beside her father during the ceremony, reached out at the right moment and held Letitia's arm just briefly, just for a moment, in the way she had on that November wedding day held her hand. And Letitia looked down at her and thought, "This is the story I am going to tell when people ask me how things changed. Not the part about arriving with nothing, though that was true. Not even the part about the deed, though that too was true and it mattered. It mattered enormously to have your name on something that was yours and cannot be taken. The story I am going to tell is about this. The ranch hand's laughter from across the yard, and the creek in the dark, and a child taking your arm in a church because she trusts you to be there, and expects to trust you still, and a man across a table in the lamplight who went slowly because that was the right way to go and never once gave her reason to regret the going. She had arrived in Harrow Creek with $4.32 and the ruins of someone else's choices, and she had found, in this dust-rowed hill country town, the particular miracle of starting over with someone who saw not what you had lost but what you were capable of. She had been handed a deed and told, "Now you have something." But the truth was larger than 30 acres of hill country land, though the land was real and the deed was real, and her name on it meant something that went down to the bedrock of who she was. The truth was that what she had now was everything. The full, unglamorous, wildflower and cedar and cricket song everything of a life that had been rebuilt not from materials that were new, but from materials that were honest, hammered into shape by her own hands and his, side by side in the good plain light of the Texas hill country, permanent and real and entirely, irrevocably hers. 2 years after James was born, in the early months of 1882, she found herself pregnant again. She told Clement in the same kitchen, at the same table, and he responded with the same stunned opening joy that he had the first time, as though he had not quite allowed himself to hope for it again. Clara, now 14 and possessed of an increasingly sophisticated commentary on events, said only, "I hope it is a girl this time. James is very good, but he is also very loud," which was accurate on both counts. James at 2.5 was an energetic, determined, and thoroughly joyful presence who had taken to following Walt Decker around the near pasture with the solemn intention of learning everything there was to know about cattle, and who had not yet developed the concept of an indoor voice. The pregnancy progressed well through the spring of 1882, and in the autumn of that year, on a Saturday morning in October when the hill country was at its finest, all clear sky and turning live oak, and the smell of cedar and coming cold, Letitia's second child was born in the same upstairs room, with the same doctor, Wills, and the same Rosaria, and Clara once again sat in the hall with her drawing things, this time sketching a detailed picture of James, who was sitting beside her eating an apple with great concentration and occasional commentary. It was a girl. Letitia held her while the October morning came through the window and looked at her pink and composed and already regarding the world with a focused attention that was going to be someone's particular challenge in about 14 years, and thought about names. She named her Eleanor. Clement, when he came in and saw her and heard the name, could not speak for a moment. He sat down on the edge of the bed and put his hand over his eyes and breathed carefully, and Letitia let him have that moment without filling it. Then he looked up and looked at his daughter and then at his wife. "Are you certain?" he said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. I want to. She was important to you. She was important to Clara. She should have a name that remembers her." He looked at little Clement Hayes, who was looking back at him with the gravity of the newly arrived. "Clement," he said softly. Clara came in from the hall when she heard that the baby had been named. She stood in the doorway with her sketchbook under her arm and looked at the infant in Letitia's arms, and when she heard the name she looked at Letitia with eyes that were very bright. "That is right," she said. "Just that." Then she came and sat at the foot of the bed and opened her sketchbook and began drawing. James appeared in the doorway a few moments later, having finished his apple, and looked at the baby with the evaluative expression of a child assessing a potential competitor. He looked at her for a long moment. "She is small," he said. "She will get bigger," Letitia said, as she had said to Clara about him 3 years before. "She can have my old carved horse," he said, with the magnanimity of a 2-year-old who has already moved on to better toys, and went back to the hall to resume his education in cattle matters. Clement laughed, the real laugh, the full one, and it filled the October room and went out the window into the hill country morning, and Letitia closed her eyes and held her daughter and listened to it. The years settled into themselves after that with the particular quality of a life that is not without difficulty, but is fundamentally right. The double bar H grew and prospered. The breeding program matured, and by 1884 the ranch had a regional reputation for the quality of its stock that brought buyers from as far as Fort Worth. The South Pasture, Letitia's 30 acres along the creek, ran cattle in the summer and produced a modest orchard, apples and plums, that she had planted in the spring of 1881 with Tommy Birch's help, the fruit trees growing steadily year by year until by 1884 they were producing enough to fill the root cellar and have surplus for the town. Clara, at 17, had written a careful monograph on the insects of the Texas Hill Country, which Letitia had helped her organize and copy out in a clean hand, and which had been sent to a naturalist at the University of Texas, who had written back with such enthusiastic response that Clara had spent 3 days in a state of concentrated excitement before settling back into her habitual composed manner. She was going to study natural history formally, and they were already making plans for it, Letitia researching institutions and Clement providing the financial means with the straightforward generosity of a father who believed completely in his daughter's capacity to do exactly what she said she was going to do. James, 4 years old and currently in charge of a very small corner of the near pasture, which Walt Decker had assigned to him, with the serious formality of a man handing over real responsibility, was growing into exactly the kind of person the double bar H needed, practical and outdoor loving, and deeply attached to the land in a way that was not chosen, but simply constitutive of who he was. He called Letitia Mama, and had never called her anything else and never would, and the ease of this still moved her sometimes, the pure simplicity of being someone's mother. Little Eleanor was 2, opinionated, luminously healthy, and had her grandfather Langley's coloring, her grandmother's dark hair and the gray eyes of Memphis Langley's going back several generations. And she had already her father's way of looking at you as though she was deciding what you were worth before she gave you her full attention. She would give everyone a run for their money in about 12 years, and everyone on the double bar H already knew it and was preparing accordingly. Rosaria, who had now been at the double bar H for 16 years and had watched all of this from the kitchen with the calm authority of a woman who has seen everything, and found most of it less surprising than other people seemed to, made her assessment of the household one October evening in 1884, while she and Letitia were putting up the last of the plum preserves from the south orchard. She looked at the rows of filled jars on the kitchen table and at Letitia across from her, and she said, "When you came here, this house was dead." "It wasn't dead," Letitia said. "It was waiting." "Same thing," Rosaria said, and went back to sealing jars. Letitia thought about that for a moment, and then she thought, perhaps a house waiting is a kind of dying, and a house that is lived in fully is the way such things come back. She had arrived and found ledgers in disorder and curtainless windows, and a man who had forgotten what it was to have evenings that meant something, and she had not fixed any of it deliberately. She had simply been present and capable and willing to stay, and the staying had done what it did when it was genuine. That evening she sat with Clement on the south porch, their porch now, the porch that looked out over the creek parcel that bore her name in the county land records. And the October evening was doing what October evenings in the hill country do, performing the specific gold and blue and cedar-scented act of autumn that she had watched now for 6 years, and that she had not once found less than remarkable. James was somewhere in the near pasture with Reuben the horse, who was old now but steady, as Clement had said Walt would teach James properly about horses before James got it into his head to try anything impractical. Eleanor was asleep upstairs. Clara was writing letters at the kitchen table, her lamp a yellow square in the window. She and Clement sat in the early dark with the sounds of the ranch around them. The distant cattle, the horses, the night birds starting up, the creek somewhere below them running over its limestone bed, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was one of the great luxuries of a marriage built on honest ground, that you could sit in silence, and the silence was not absence but presence. After a long time, Clement said, "Do you remember what you told me the night I asked you to marry me? You said quickly would be wrong." "I did say that," she said. "I've been thinking about that lately," he said. "How right it was. Everything we have here, it was built on time, taking time with things." "I had already rushed through one life," she said. "I was not going to rush through another." He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and the night settled over the double bar H in its customary way, immense and quiet and full of stars, the stars that had been doing this long before any of them were here and would continue long after, indifferent to human stories, but they're above them all the same, permanent and real and burning with their own quiet light. "Letitia," he said. "Yes," she said. "You made this what it is." She turned her head and looked at him. In the dark his face had the quality of something she had been memorizing for 6 years, every line and expression and the particular way his eyes looked in different lights, and she was still learning it, which was the very best thing about it. "You handed me a deed," she said, "and told me I had something, but I think I had something the moment I walked up to your door with $4 in my pocket and asked for work. I just didn't know it yet." He looked at her. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her when something she said reached him in the place. He kept the things that mattered most with that expression of unguarded attention that was the truest version of himself, and that he had given her and no one else since Eleanor, and that she held as one of the most precious things in her possession. "No," he said. "You knew it. You knew it from the beginning. That's why you walked 4 miles in the heat and asked for work instead of sitting in town and being sorry for yourself." She thought about that. Maybe he was right. Maybe the knowing had always been there, not confidence, not certainty, but the stubborn, insisting thing that had made her keep moving even when she had every reason to stop. The thing that had made her walk the 4 miles and sit down at the disordered desk and find the $40 discrepancy and hang the curtains in Clara's room and say yes to the deed and yes to the marriage and yes, over and over, to everything the hill country had offered. Maybe that had always been the something. Not the 30 acres, not the deed, not even this life that she and Clement had built between them, though all of it was real and all of it was hers. The something that she had brought with her, the only thing she had not lost in Memphis and could not have lost because it was not external at all. She had come to Harrow Creek with it. She had walked 4 miles through Texas heat with it in her pocket and sat down at a stranger's desk and begun. The rest was the living of it, day by day, year by year, in this house and on this land, with this man and these children and Rosaria in the kitchen making soup for every major occasion, and the creek running in the dark below the south pasture and the bluebonnets in April and the stars year-round. Faithful and permanent above the hill country of Texas, above the double bar H. above everything that had been built here out of honest materials and patient hands, and the kind of love that does not announce itself loudly, but simply keeps showing up, morning after morning, in the clear and irreplaceable light. The years that came after were the quietest and the fullest, which was as it should be. James grew into a lean, deliberate young man who could work cattle all day and still come to the kitchen table in the evening, with questions about the accounts that told her he had his father's instinct for the land and her own eye for the numbers, and she taught him both with the same patient pleasure that Clara's lessons had given her. Elena grew into a fierce and warm-hearted girl who had opinions about everything and apologized for none of them, who could ride by the time she was 5, and could out-argue the ranch hands by the time she was 7, and who loved her father with a ferocity that made him quietly, privately, incandescent. Clara went to study in Austin in 1885 and wrote letters home every 2 weeks without fail, letters full of the things she was learning and the professors she was impressing, and the specific insects of the Austin cedar breaks which she found insufficiently documented and intended to correct. She came home for Christmas and for summers, and every time she came home the house filled up in a way it only did when she was in it, and James and Elena followed her around like satellites for the first 2 days, and Clement sat at the dinner table on her first evening back every year with the expression of a man who has gotten something back that he did not entirely believe he deserved. In 1887, Clara finished her studies and received a letter of invitation from the same University of Texas naturalist who had first written to her, offering her a position as his assistant in the preparation of a comprehensive survey of Texas hill country flora and fauna. She came home that Christmas with the letter in her pocket and read it to the family at the kitchen table after dinner, and the kitchen filled with the noise of celebration, James pounding the table, Elena demanding to know every detail, Rosaria appearing in the doorway with an expression of pure vindicated satisfaction, Clement getting up from his chair and hugging his daughter with both arms and saying nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. Letitia watched all of it from across the table with her coffee in her hands, and her heart so full it was a physical fact, a warm and pressing thing in her chest, and she thought, here it is. Here is the closed account, the one that balances perfectly, the ledger that began in disorder and became, over years of careful work and genuine love, something orderly and beautiful and producing exactly what it ought. She had arrived in Harrow Creek with nothing, and she had been handed a deed and told, now you have something. And she had understood in that moment that the deed was not merely land but declaration, not merely property but proof that a person could begin again, that the losses that felt permanent were not always permanent, that 30 acres of hill country Texas and a steady man and a clear night sky and a child's hand in yours could add up to a life so full that the empty years before it looked, from this distance, like only what they were, the necessary road to here. She set down her coffee cup and reached across the table and took Clement's hand, and he turned from his conversation with Clara and looked at her, and across 6 rooms and 6 years and everything between them his eyes said what they had always said in those unguarded moments. I see you, I am glad you are here, this is real. She smiled at him. He smiled back. Outside, the December hill country was doing its quiet winter work under a sky full of stars, and the creek ran in the cold dark over the limestone below the south pasture, and the double bar H stood in the Texas night as it had stood for years, and would stand for years more solid and working and warm, full of the sound of people who belonged to each other, who had built something honest together from the raw material of second chances and the particular courage of beginning again. It was everything. It was hers. It was enough and more than enough, and it was, from first step to last, entirely and completely real.